The storm had settled like a living thing over the mountains, thick snow curling across the ridges and filling every hollow with white silence. Trees groaned beneath its weight. The world seemed swallowed whole, hushed beneath the steady drift. From that silence came a man, staggering out of the timber as if spit forth by the storm itself. His coat was torn, one arm pressed hard against his side, where the darker blood seeped through wool and froze into black ice. His breath rasped, each exhale a ragged cloud. He stumbled, boots breaking through crusted snow, and pitched forward until his face lay buried in it. For a long moment, he did not rise. At the edge of the clearing, a cabin crouched low against the wind. Smoke feathered from its chimney. Thin and desperate, a mark of stubborn survival. Within its walls, a woman sat bent over her work. Her fingers tugged thread through worn fabric, the needle glinting in firelight. She mended not for vanity, but for necessity, each stitch a matter of endurance. The world outside might be vast, but her life was narrowed to wood, flame, and silence. She had grown used to it, though not fond. Loneliness had its own sound, and she carried it like a weight in her chest. The sound came first as a thump, muffled by snow but unnatural in its rhythm. She froze, needle in hand, head cocked toward the door. Another sound followed, something heavy dragged through ice. She rose, her skirt brushing against the worn floorboards, and crossed to the window. The glass was clouded, but she could make out the shape. A man collapsed near the woodpile, his body dark against the pale drift. Her first instinct was caution. She had learned that in a land where law lay miles away and mercy was often thinner than a blade, strangers carried hunger, and hunger was dangerous. But the figure did not move save for the faint lift of breath. Against her better judgment, she unbarred the door. The cold rushed in like a thief, biting at her face. She stepped out, boots sinking deep, skirts dragging, and reached him. His skin was ash pale, his beard crusted with ice, his eyes shut tight. She saw the blood staining his side, seeping through layers of cloth. It took all her strength to haul him inside. He was heavy as a felled tree, every inch of him worn with hardship. She pulled him past the threshold, kicked the door shut, and dragged him near the hearth where flames fought to keep the dark at bay. For a time, she only knelt beside him, catching her own breath. His chest rose, shallow but steady. He was alive, though death had a hand on his shoulder. Her basket of mending was pushed aside, replaced with basin of water warmed over fire. She tore what cloth she could spare, laid it beside her. His coat she cut open, hands trembling but steady enough to do the work. The wound was deep, likely from a blade or jagged branch. She could not tell, and he did not stir to explain. She cleaned it, biting back the urge to flinch as fresh blood welled. He groaned, head turning, but his eyes did not open. The needle she had threaded from mending cloth now found another use. She set her jaw, threaded finer line, and with fingers numb from fear, she sewed flesh as she would sew fabric. The firelight caught her face in stark relief, sweat shining along her temple, lashes tipped with the dam of effort. Each pull of thread bound more than skin. It stitched her fate to his, though she did not yet know it. The hours dragged. Snow pressed heavy against the roof. Wind moaned at the shutters. She sat vigil beside him, replacing cloth after cloth as they soaked red. When at last the bleeding slowed, she allowed herself a breath that shivered in her chest. His face in the firelight was rough-hewn, scarred by years that had carved more than time. His hair was streaked with gray. His hands, calloused, swollen with labor, rested palm up, as if open to judgment. She studied him in the silence, curiosity pushing past fear. A man like this did not wander into a storm by chance. He carried a history as heavy as the snow that pinned him here. Yet she did not ask. She had her own silences, her own histories whispered behind her back in town. Better not to ask what might wound more than the gash in his side. Through the night she kept the fire alive. Each stick would fed to flame like an offering. His breathing steadied, sometimes breaking into a cough that rattled through the cabin. When he stirred, muttering nonsense, she pressed water to his lips. Her hands trembled not from fear now, but from the weight of responsibility. As dawn broke, pale light seeped through frost-laced windows. The storm had not passed, but it had quieted. She sat at her table, exhausted, watching the figure by the fire. He slept now, his wound bound, his face turned toward the warmth. There was no telling what day might bring, what story would unfold once he opened his eyes. She knew only this. The rhythm of her life had shifted. The silence she had worn like a cloak was broken, filled now with the slow, uneven breath of a stranger. Her gaze drifted to the cradle in the corner, its wooden slats catching the weak light. Dust gathered on its edges. She had not touched it in years, could not bring herself to move it, though it stood as a reminder of every word spoken behind her back. Barren, they called her. Wasted, they whispered. Yet here was a man, carried into her home by storm and fate, his life tied now to her hands. She rose and moved to the fire, adjusting the blankets that covered him. His skin no longer held the chill of death. Her fingers lingered a moment longer than necessary, brushing the coarse fabric at his shoulder. She felt something stir, not yet named, not yet trusted. The storm pressed to the walls, the wind carrying its long, mournful cry. But within the cabin, another kind of storm had begun, silent and unmarked by snow. She did not know if he would rise again, nor what debts his past might lay at her door. Yet as she looked upon him, she felt the first shift of a season, as if winter itself had cracked and led to the faintest promise of change. And in that quiet, with snow drifting like ash beyond the window, she knew her solitude had ended, whether for salvation or ruin. The mountains had delivered a wounded man to her hearth, and the course of her life bent with it. The storm came down from the high ridges like judgment, burying the valley in drifts so deep they swallowed fence posts and pressed the cabin door shut. For 3 days the world beyond the windows vanished, nothing but a blur of white and the ceaseless moan of wind. Within, the air grew thick with smoke and the smell of wood smoke clinging to wool. Time slowed to a crawl, every hour marked not by the sun, but by the ritual of feeding the fire and keeping alive against the hungry cold. The man grew stronger, though his wound still pulled at him with every movement. He was restless, pacing the narrow cabin when the pain allowed, his bulk too large for the small space. He split kindling indoors when the storm made it impossible to fetch more from the pile outside, the axe ringing against the block while she stitched in her chair. Their tasks overlapped, the rhythm of one answering the other, until the silence felt shared rather than solitary. He spoke little at first, words broken and brief, as if language itself had been worn thin by years of exile. She did not press him. Questions were heavy things, and the walls already held enough weight. Still, in the long nights when the storm clawed the roof and neither could sleep, his voice began to unwind. He spoke in fragments, low and rough, of trails that led nowhere, of brothers who turned enemies, of a life lived with one foot always in the wilderness. He did not name places or faces, but she could hear the ache in him, the regret that curled beneath each pause. She listened, her hands never still, the thread slipping through cloth with steady grace. She did not judge him. Her own silences were older than his confessions, and she knew the cost of carrying shame. Sometimes she answered with nothing more than the sound of the needle pulling tight. At other times she offered a single sentence, soft but sure, enough to remind him he was not speaking into emptiness. One evening, when the storm raged loud enough to drown all else, she sat by the hearth mending his shirt, the one torn and stained beyond repair. Her head bent low, hair falling loose across her cheek, the glow of flame catching the thread between her fingers. He watched her, leaning in the chair opposite, his wound wrapped and his body stiff with the effort of healing. Something pressed at him then, heavier than pain, heavier even than the judgment of the town that would come once he stepped outside again. "You ought not sit alone like this," he said, his voice low, swallowed almost whole by the wind against the shutters. She glanced up, needle poised in the air, but said nothing. He drew a breath that rattled, as though the words themselves cost him more than the wound. "I'll make you a mother before summer." The fire cracked. Outside, the storm howled as if it heard. Inside, the words settled like ash in the air, heavy, impossible to ignore. Her hand trembled. The needle slipped, pricking her finger, and a bead of red welled bright against the pale of her skin. She pressed it quickly to her skirt, the stain lost in the dark fabric. She did not answer, not with words. She bent again to her sewing, though the thread faltered, trembling in her grasp. The silence between them thickened. He did not look away, though shame burned in his gaze. He had spoken too plain, too hard, and the weight of it pressed on him now. Yet he had not meant it as cruelty. He had seen the cradle in the corner, the dust upon it, the way her eyes sometimes lingered on its empty space. He had heard enough whispers in town to know the name they pinned to her, barren, wasted, half a woman. He had no patience for their judgment. To him, she was whole already, carved out of strength and silence. His words had been a vow, a promise of belonging, though they tumbled out clumsy and raw. She sewed on, though the stitched line wavered. Her breath came quick, betraying the storm inside her chest. No man had ever promised her anything but absence. Husbands, suitors, neighbors, they gave pity or mockery or nothing at all. And here was a man half dead at her door weeks ago, offering not pity, but a pledge spoken with the blunt edge of truth. Hours passed, or maybe only moments. The storm outside swallowed all measured time. She finished her mending, folded the shirt and set it aside. Her hands lingered in her lap, fingers curled tight together. At last she looked at him. Her eyes held no anger, no laughter either, only a quiet searching, as though weighing whether he had spoken from mercy or from need. "You speak foolish in the storm's dark," she said softly. He did not deny it. His gaze dropped to the fire, where the logs collapsed inward with a sigh. "Maybe so, but I've known enough of wandering, enough of carrying nothing but my own hide through winter. I'd set something right if you'd let me." The words hung there, rough as unshaped timber, but steady. He did not touch her, did not lean close. He left the space between them untouched, waiting. She rose, taking the base from the hearth to pour out the cooled water. Her skirts brushed the floorboards, her back straight despite the weight in her chest. She moved as though nothing had passed between them. Yet the air was charged different now, as if a line had been drawn that neither could step back over. That night she lay awake on her narrow bed, the storm still clawing at the roof. The words echoed, refusing to fade. A promise made not in tenderness, not in romance, but in a kind of desperate honesty. She turned toward the wall. The quilt pulled tight around her shoulders and let her mind wander to things she had buried long ago. The weight of a child in her arms, the warmth of being seen without judgment. Hope hurt worse than any loss. And yet, in the darkness, she found herself holding to it as one holds to a candle guttering in wind. He, too, did not sleep. He lay on the floor near the fire, eyes open to the shadows dancing on the beams above. His vow burned through him, reckless and raw. But for the first time in years, he felt not hollow but tethered, bound by something more than survival. He had spoken clumsy, but the truth of it would not loosen. When morning came, the storm eased. Light spilled pale through frost-framed glass. The snow was piled high, the world remade. Inside, the air held a different stillness, fragile as ice but unbroken. They met each other's eyes across the room, and though no more was spoken, the promise lingered, alive between them, heavy as the drifts that pressed against the cabin walls. The season would not wait. Neither, perhaps, would fate. The storm pressed hard against the cabin, snow slamming at the shutters as though the mountains themselves wished to swallow the place whole. For days the world outside had been nothing but white, the sky and earth bound together in one endless drift. Inside, the fire burned low, smoke curling in the rafters, and the air grew tight with silence. Time stretched thin, each hour marked only by the crack of a log splitting or the quiet scratch of her needle working through cloth. The man healed slowly, though his wound made him restless. He paced the narrow room like a caged animal, broad shoulders brushing against the beams, his breath hitching each time the stitches pulled. He would split kindling indoors, the axe rising and falling in steady rhythm, while she sewed in her chair, eyes lower but always aware of him moving across the room. Their lives had fallen into a strange harmony, the rhythm of one folding into the rhythm of the other, as if they had lived beneath the same roof longer than a season. Words came sparingly. At first, his voice was little more than gravel. Short phrases offered like tokens. She did not press him. The cabin had long taught her the worth of silence, and she respected the way his quiet sat heavy, unforced. But on nights when the storm raged loudest, when sleep refused them both, His voice would uncoil at last. He spoke of long trails where the horizon was his only companion, of friends turned enemies, of winters endured by little more than grit. He left names unspoken, but she heard the sorrow braided into his pauses. She did not answer with judgments. Her hands kept their steady work, the needle drawing thread through cloth, her face bent toward firelight. When she did speak, it was with small things, a word here, a thought there, that told him she was listening. It was enough to keep him going. He had known women who met his words with suspicion or mockery, but never one who met them with quiet endurance. It unnerved him, and it eased him all the same. One evening, the storm swelled to its fiercest pitch. Snow pounded the door. The timbers groaned, and the windows rattled as though the glass might shatter. She sat by the hearth with his shirt in her lap, the torn fabric nearly beyond saving. The thread gleamed faintly in the firelight, her hair falling across her cheek as she bent to her task. He watched her from the chair opposite, his body aching but stronger now, his gaze fixed not on the storm but on her. Something pressed at him, heavier than the pain in his side. He had carried many burdens, betrayal, hunger, loneliness, but this was different. It was the sight of her, bent over her mending, the fire drawing lines of light across her worn face. It was the way she did not complain though the storm threatened to bury them whole. The words rose before he stopped them, raw and unpolished. "You ought not sit alone like this," he said, voice low, nearly lost in the wind. She looked up, needle poised in the air. Her eyes flickered, questioning. His jaw tightened, but he did not turn away. "I'll make you a mother before summer." The words cracked through the silence like a rifle's report. The fire snapped, sparks leaping, and outside the storm howled louder still, as if the world itself heard and bore witness. Her hand faltered. The needle pricked her finger, a bead of red rising against her pale skin. She pressed it quickly to her skirt, eyes lowered again, but her breath had changed, quickened, betraying the storm now alive inside her. No man had ever said such a thing to her. In town, they called her barren, whispered that her life was wasted. She had grown used to being seen as less, to bear in the way of silence, while others judged from safe distance. And here was a stranger, ragged and scarred, who had stumbled half dead into her arms, offering not pity but a vow. She did not answer him. Her fingers trembled as they pulled the thread through cloth, the stitch line wavering. The air between them thickened, charged with something neither of them could name, without shattering it. He felt the shame of his own bluntness, but he did not retract the words. He had seen her strength, her care, the loneliness that had not broken her. He had no fine speech to offer, no courtship polished by town manners. Only the rough promise of a man who had wandered long enough to know the worth of belonging. When she set the shirt aside, folded neat despite its scars, she finally looked at him. Her gaze held steady, unreadable. After a long moment, she said quietly, "Storm's dark makes men speak foolish." He nodded once, but his eyes did not leave hers. "Maybe so. Still, I've lived too long carrying only myself. I'd set something right, if you'd allow it." Her face softened, though no smile came. She rose, moving to pour out the cool basin of water, skirts brushing the floorboards. She gave him no further words, but her silence was different now. Not rejection. Something else. Something unspoken, fragile as frost on glass. That night, she lay in her narrow bed with the quilt pulled high, the storm clawing at the walls. His vow echoed in her mind, refusing to fade. She had buried hope long ago, convinced it was safer never to expect. Yet the words lingered, warming her in a way the fire could not. She turned her face into the dark, afraid of wanting, afraid of losing, yet unable to let go. On the floor by the hearth, he too lay awake, staring into shadows that flickered across the beams. The vow he had spoken sat heavy on his chest, reckless and raw, but he did not regret it. For the first time in years, he felt tethered to something more than survival. When morning came, the storm eased. Pale light spilled through frost-laced windows. Snow lay deep against the door, sealing them in. She moved about the room with steady hands, stoking the fire, setting bread to warm. He watched her, silent, but when her eyes lifted to meet his, The weight of what passed between them hung unbroken. The promise lingered, fragile but alive, like the first bud beneath snow, unseen but certain. Spring broke slowly, prying winter's grip from the valley with reluctant hands. The snow softened first, sinking into slush that muddied the path to the creek. Then the river thawed, roaring with new force, tearing free the ice that bound it. Birds returned, tentative at first, then bold, their calls spilling into the cabin silence. Within, change moved just as surely, though it showed itself in quieter ways. The man healed. His stride no longer staggered. His strength returned with the chopping of wood and the hauling of stone. Yet something heavier than his wound pressed on him. He had made a vow in the storm, words that still rang in the air between them. He carried it like a brand, half fearing he had spoken folly, half clinging to it as the truest thing he'd ever said. She moved about her work with the same steadiness as before, tending hearth and soil, patching cloth, walking into town when need forced her. But she too had changed. The weight of judgment still clung to her there. Whispers at the mercantile, looks that cut sharper than knives. Yet she no longer bowed her head beneath them. She walked upright, as if the storm had burned the shame out of her. The townsfolk noticed, though they did not understand. Some scowled, others laughed. She endured both with a stillness they could not shake. The promise lay between them, unspoken since that night, yet it colored every glance, every gesture. When he steadied her arm on the icy path, when she pressed bread into his hands fresh from the fire, the vow breathed between them. Neither named it, but neither forgot. The thaw brought work. The land needed mending after winter's wait. Fences had collapsed beneath snow, roofs sagged with rot. Together they set themselves to it. He drove posts into the softened ground, his hands raw with effort. She held them steady, her fingers firm, her body leaning into strain as if it mattered that she not falter. They worked side by side, their sweat mingling with the damp of thaw, and each shared task. They learned to measure one another, but work alone could not shield them from the stir of conflict. One afternoon, returning from town with flour and salt, she found him waiting at the edge of the yard. His jaw was tight, his hand still resting near the axe he'd been carrying. She saw at once something had happened. "Men spoke of you," he said, voice low. "Spoke of me, too. Called you fool for taking me in. Said I'd eat you out of hearth and home, then be gone." Her face did not change, though the words pierced deep. She had long lived with scorn, but now it carried new edge. His presence had stirred the town's mouths afresh. "And what did you answer them?" she asked. "I said nothing, but I thought to." His eyes burned, his body taut as a rope ready to snap. "I thought to break their teeth in the snow." A flicker of heat stirred in her chest. Not anger at him, but the way the world always demanded payment for kindness. Let them wag their tongues. You owe them no word. He stared a moment longer, then let the axe fall into the dirt, his shoulders slackening. "I owe you truth, though," he said. "If I leave, it won't be because of them. Only if you bid me go." The words hung, heavy as storm clouds. She did not speak, not yet. She turned instead to her basket, to the cloth folded there, her hands trembling though she forced them still. At last she said, barely above a whisper, "You made a vow in winter's dark. Do you still mean it now the thaw has come?" He lifted his head, eyes fierce despite the weary years. "I meant it then. I mean it now. I'll keep it if you'll have me." The silence stretched, broken only by the rush of meltwater in the creek. Her heart beat fast, louder than the current, louder than the scorn she had lived with all her days. She looked at him, saw the lines carved deep by regret, the scars on his hands, the wound he still carried beneath the shirt. He was no savior, but he was steady, and he had chosen her when the world had turned its back. She stepped closer, laying her hand against his roughened cheek. Her touch was light, uncertain, but he leaned into it as though it anchored him. "Then stay," she said. The thaw quickened after that. Days grew longer. The earth soft beneath their feet. The cabin filled with the scent of soil and new grass, with bread rising on the hearth and the sharp tang of pine. Their bond grew not in sudden fire, but in the steady warmth of shared labor, in the brush of his hand over hers as they planted seed, in her laughter rare but true, when he carved a crooked spoon only for her. The climax came not in town, not in battle, but in the meadow beyond the cabin. The snow had melted to reveal earth rich and dark, and wildflowers pressed up to thaw as if eager for life. There, standing together, they felt the shift that had begun in winter complete itself. She pressed his hand to her belly, her gaze steady, her lips parting in the smallest, trembling smile. He understood without words. For a long moment, the world was silent but for the creek's rush and the wind in the pines. His eyes closed, his shoulders sagging as though a lifetime's burden had been lifted. When he opened them again, there was fire in his gaze, not a fury, but a devotion. "You kept me alive," he whispered. "Now I'll keep the vow." The valley, wide and endless, seemed to breathe with them, the thaw complete not just in earth but in their hearts. They stood together, bound not by storm or shame, but by the quiet strength of two souls who had chosen each other. And in the hush of that meadow, where winter had broken at last, their story began anew,